Over 4 months ago, I picked up Freyna, popped in an activator, chucked a couple of catalysts her way, and made a video talking about her 3 strongest builds that she had for the time, turning into my most viewed video, like, in ever. Now, since then, we've had the biggest glow up of all time hit Freyna, taking her from feeling pretty mid on a good day to becoming an absolute frame tanking monster. And while I've made a couple of builds early doors for you for how I've been rocking it, I feel it's only right that I bring to you her 4 best builds that you need right now to be able to handle every single bit of this content that's currently in the game. Now, in this video, we'll be looking at how to put together the best presets for generic mobbing and defense mission clears, max DPS mobbing to be able to help clear those 400% invasion missions, your fast and early door Colossus kills for material farming, and lastly, a more tanky setup to help take on that pesky Deathstalker. Now, we've got the weaponry to look at, we've got reactors to break down, so this will probably be a little bit longer than the ones that you're usually seeing, so if you're all buckled in and settled, let's get to it. So this video is going to start off a little bit differently compared to previous videos, and the reason why is because we do have some common grounds that exist across every single one of the builds. We're going to start off with the weaponry, we're then going to move on to the component set, then to the reactor talk, and then we're going to start breaking down those modules. Now, if you're just purely interested in terms of like the builds, this video is timestamped, so feel free to be able to actually go and find a place that you need to be able to check out. That's not a problem whatsoever, but we're going to start breaking down everything, and we're going to lead up to those modules as well. So first and foremost, we're going to start talking about that weaponry side of things. Now, obviously we can't carry 3 weapons at a time when it comes to Freyna. Ideally, you only want the 1 weapon to be able to actually use for every single one of these builds, and that is going to be the Secret Garden. The Secret Garden currently, as it stands just before Season 2 actually does drop, is the best in slot when it comes to Freyna, just purely because of how the special ability of the Secret Garden works. And if I hold down F1, we can now go over to the unique ability. You can see I've got this maxed out at rank 4, and the main thing that we're going to be focusing on is going to be this pest control, because we do have a 50% trigger rate of being able to get extra increases to our generic skill power, and this being able to get up to 3 stacks is a huge amount of like skill power that we're able to kind of like chuck our way, and this is going to go straight into every single one of our skills. Now, the one thing that this won't do is going to boost up our skill 4. Unfortunately, because you do put this weapon away, it does take away those skills, so therefore you're not going to be benefiting from that extra skill power into your skill 4, which is going to be your alternate or your form of weapon basically. So for that, but it will boost up every single bit of DPS in terms of your skill 1 as well as your skill 3. It also boosts up the viability of the poison that you get from skill 2. But obviously not many people do tend to rock that, and if you do use a transcendent mod, you can actually change what that skill 2 does. So just know this is going to be the most way of you being able to get the most amount of damage from your mobbing side of things. This is going to be the best way to being able to increase your damage. Now, if we're going to have a look in terms of like how I would recommend that you set this up, there are a couple of things that I do recommend that you need in every single setup that you do have for the Secret Garden. So you can obviously, because of the presets at the top, you can have it built up several different ways. This is the one that I think has just kind of like fell for me. This is the one that I would probably recommend across every single one of the builds. It's just a very nice combination of building up the viability of your skill 4, as well as increasing the amount of damage just in case you actually do need to shoot the Secret Garden. So the first thing that we do need to be able to focus on is going to be what is needed for our skill 4, and this is going to be a couple of things that are going to transfer across. The main ones for this are going to be fire rate up. This is going to increase your fire rate of your skill 4 by 25%, which is fantastic. It does also improve the DPS of your Secret Garden, which is quite nice. It's already a fairly fast kind of firing gun, if I remember right. So being able to increase that fire rate is quite nice. But using that along with sharp precision shot is also going to be a way of being able to increase your fire rate as well. So firearm attack doesn't transfer over, weak points that your skill can't do. Being able to go for like critical shots and everything like that, it does not affect, it doesn't carry over. So the main thing that we do want to focus on is going to be that fire rate. So being able to grab sharp precision shots by holding down that trigger, that does carry over, and that does mean that we can get an extra 40% increase to our fire rate while using our skill 4. And because of doing that, and because of how this actually ramps it up, it means we don't need any duration skills on our Freyna builds. So therefore we can actually fire every single one of these shots from start to finish without actually letting go of the trigger, and we don't need to put any kind of increase to duration, which is fantastic. Now, the other 2 mods that we do need to be able to slot in here are going to be magazine upgrades. This does actually carry over into your skill 4, so therefore we will get additional shots for every single one, for every single time we activate that skill. So the best ones to be able to go for really here are going to be your expand weapon charge. That is a huge amount in terms of just shy of 50% increase right there. And then compulsion magazine is also going to be the best bang for your buck, giving you an extra 39% on top of that. So that does give you an extra 88% of your rounds to be able to play with. If you can actually get a magazine roll to be able to go into your Secret Garden. I do believe that does transfer over as well. That can give you a few extra shots as well. But personally, I've just not messed about with it too much to be able to do that. So Secret Garden currently is set up for actually doing DPS if I'm shooting the gun. Now, in terms of the rest of the mods, I would recommend being able to increase the actual DPS in terms of the actual gun itself. The best ones to be able to go for, because Secret Garden is a ridiculously high kind of like critical hit fire rate and also critical hit damage kind of gun. I would recommend going into your standard stuff, which is going to be your firearm attack as well as your firearm attack for, so going for rifling, reinforcements, and action reaction. After that, going for concentration priority is going to be a really nice way of being able to increase that critical hit damage. That does also work really nicely with better concentration. Going for better insight gives you more critical hit rate, which is great as well. And then on top of that, we've gone for a weak point sight, because I do think that the 68.5% is kind of a nice balance. You can swap that out and be able to go for even more critical hit rate. So if you want to be able to go for something like edging shot, feel free to be able to go for that. That will make it a little bit more consistent in terms of like feeling with you to actually shoot your gun. But to be honest with you, you're never really going to be shooting your gun too much. It's only going to be against stubborn targets. So you're primarily relying on your actual skills to do most of the work, and essentially you're using your Secret Garden as a stat stick to be able to do that. So we've talked about everything to do with the weaponry. Obviously, you can go for other options to be able to match your reactor, for example. So my bossing setup, in terms of like Colossus skill power, in terms of on my reactor, is actually on my Greg's Reverse Fate. I haven't swapped that over just yet. So obviously, you do want to go for the exact same stuff to be able to match that up. So compulsive magazine, you do want to go for your expand weapon charge, sharp precision shot, and your fire rate up. Those are the 4 things that you do want to be able to make sure stay on that gun. You know, ideally, you want your reactor to be able to match back to Secret Garden, but if you can't, don't worry too much about it. You can just put it on other guns as well. So let's start talking about components then. So in my personal opinion, the best set in slot here is going to be a 4-piece of the Distorted Resolve. Now, unfortunately, you do kind of have to go into specific builds to be able to get the most out of this, and it is also locked behind Deathstalker. Now, we will be talking about builds to be able to help you out with Deathstalker. You can do it without the Distorted Resolve, obviously, because that's how you get things and start being able to farm. Personally, because of that increase in the amount of toxic skill power that you'll get, while it is lower than that of Slayer, Slayer does have that drawback of skill cost affecting the usefulness of Freyna's red mods and how often she can actually cast her skills. So if we actually have a comparison, you can see that we do have a 26.1% increase to skill power if a 4-piece Slayer, but being able to go for Distorted Resolve only gives us 14.3%. So we are losing out to around about 12%, which is a bit of a shame, but to be honest with you, it's kind of negligible compared to how we're going to be setting this up. Being able to go into this Distorted Resolve does have some extra benefits. One of the main things is obviously Slayer has that increase to skill cost. That's going to be affecting red mods like we've just talked about, but it's also going to be affecting your skill 1, your skill 3, and eventually that means that you're not going to be able to cast all your skills kind of reliably. So if you are going for mobbing setups, if you're not actually killing fast enough, then Slayer is going to eventually kind of impact you in some kind of way, whereas Distorted Resolve, while you do have to build around 1 HP, you will actually get, it's more consistent in terms of being able to throw out your skills. You won't have to worry about MP woes as much in that kind of sense. Now, the other kind of main benefit for this is the fact that every single one of the Distorted Resolve pieces has max HP, as you can see. So we've got 646, 484, 484, 646. Every single one of these is going to be chucked straight into your base HP, and being able to go straight into base HP means that using things like Overwhelming Shield, it takes all of that HP, you can go and put onto an increased HP mod. It will then stack it up even higher, and then it gets transferred even more into Overwhelming Shield. It's quite fantastic as to how this all kind of works and all comes together. I do think that max HP is better in terms of the rolls that you do get, for example, on Slayer. So as you can see, Slayer's sensor has a max shield roll in terms of on its sensor. And the sensor is one of the best parts when it comes to it. You also get defense on the actual auxiliary power. Once again, max shield. It's just not great rolls. It's just kind of a bit all over the place when it comes to Slayer. Whereas with Distorted Resolve, you have that nice consistency. You can go straight into HP, and you can work around that. So you can actually build into better builds with that. Now, of course, this set is nothing if you don't actually have the right rolls. I would recommend that if you already have a good Slayer set does kind of outperform that of the Distorted Resolve. You do want to be able to get yourself good rolls, and ideally what you want to be able to get on here is going to be things like max HP and MP recovery on your auxiliary power. You want max MP and MP recovery on your sensor. When it comes to the on your memory, you want MP recovery and either shield recovery or defense for your memory. And then lastly, you want a shield recovery and toxic resist for your processor. Obviously, there's a couple of things that I do need to be able to farm out, but it's just a couple of things, and honestly, being able to get the perfect drops is a bit of a pain. But you know, those ideally are the best things that you should be looking out for. And if you do manage to get that, I think you actually have the best Distorted Resolve kind of set that you possibly could for Freyna. And then lastly, when it comes to all the commonplace items, we're going to be talking about reactors. Now, this is my mainstay, this is my main kind of reactor that I do go for, which is my Toxic Mechanics. This does go into Secret Garden, that's ideally what you want, and because of all the changes that have happened when it comes to reactor farming, it just makes it so much easier to be able to actually slot in the weapon that you do want. So if you do manage to get the perfect rolls that you do want at the bottom, unfortunately my Toxic skill power is a little bit on the lower side, but it's still a purple roll, so it definitely does the job for what I need it to. But you want it to be a Toxic Mechanics that goes into Secret Garden. Obviously you get your Toxic and Tech skill power boost ratios as standard there, and then you also get your extra rolls at the bottom. Ideally for your generic kind of playstyle, you want a Toxic and Tech skill power boost ratio on both. Being able to go into this, it gives you the most amount of skill power into everything that you're going to be throwing out, and it allows you to be able to just generically chuck out the most amount of damage. Now, the reason why I'm saying generically is the fact that, yes, you can get more damage if you do go for additional skill attack when attacking Colossus, if you're going into Colossus farming, but what I found was that if I compared these two reactors against each other, so you can see that I've got the Toxic and Tech skill power boost ratios at the bottom, and then obviously the skill attack power and the toxic spell. The difference between these on Executioner on every single shot of my skill 4 was around about 20k. It's not really that much, especially since Executioner is weak against toxic, so you'll see like diminishing returns on that when you go against things that have normal or even high or even very high kind of resistance. So to be fair, you can get away with a Toxic Mechanics. I would recommend that you look out for this one first and foremost, but if you do manage to find one that does have a really good roll into additional skill attack and also a power boost ratio that matches with what you're going for, then obviously this is going to be a great thing to be able to keep hold of, and I would then once again recommend that you do get both of those matching into Secret Garden. But of course you're here for the main bread and butter, and that's actually going to do with these modules that we're going to be slotting into Ultimate Freyna right here. So we're going to be running through the very first 4 categories, as you can see at the top. So we've got our Farming, our Fast Colossus, our Toxin Colossus, and our DPS Mobbing. Essentially our Farming is going to be our defense missions, our Fast Colossus is going to be our very early doors, kind of like Colossus fights, or all the way up to probably just before Swamp Walker. You can get away with doing this. Toxin Colossus is going to be anything that's Swamp Walker and onwards, and then DPS Mobbing is going to be like the main 400% missions and anything kind of content-wise that you kind of need going forward. This is going to be your main generic kind of build that you will be going for, and then everything else is kind of like a little bit niche and a little bit special. Buff Please is going to be something I'm going to be talking about in a future video, so I'm not going to be showing that off just here, but just know there is something hidden behind this special tab right there. Cool, so we're going to be starting to build this up first, and the first mod that we're going to talk about is the Transcendence mod that pretty much wraps this all together. That's going to be Contagion. Contagion is fantastic for this, because every single time you get an enemy killed, and this works for every single time your skill actually detonates, Contagion is then going to detonate, kind of affecting a bunch of enemies in a wide area. That's essentially what we're going to be boosting up with range mods, and then it's going to apply Room 0 Trauma. The main downside with Contagion though, and the reason why we don't use this as a mainstay for all the builds going forward, is because it does actually sacrifice away some of our damage over time. As you can see, we only have Toxic Puddle and Room 0 Trauma. We actually do lose out on things like Panic, we lose out on Despair, we lose out on Decay, we lose out on Nightmare, so we just purely rely on that Room 0 Trauma now going forward. And while that is a good enough damage over time for this kind of content that we're going to be doing, it's not going to be strong enough really to kind of like maximize out on every single one of the 400%, so we are going to be essentially just using this to rely on like low level farming, or also just kind of like leveling up our guns. But essentially if you want to AFK, this is the one that you need for you. Now, of course, this mod by itself isn't good enough, so we do need to be able to build into the rest of it. So the main thing that we do need to be able to go for is things like cooldown. So we do slot in straight away MP conversion, as well as being able to go for Nimble Fingers. Nimble Fingers will go slotted there. And that gives us 62% of our skill cooldown, allowing us to be able to spam out our skills just in case we ever need it, and then you got those squeaky bum kind of moments, so you can rely on that. Now we also need to be able to go into the amount of damage that our abilities can do, so we do need to be, if you've watched one of my previous videos where I looked at all the combinations for like the amount of damage that we can get from Freyna and what is the best way to do this, going into power increase and then going into the amplification mods is going to be the best way to be able to do that. So we do use both tech amplification, which goes there, as well as toxic amplification. Oh, I've put it in the wrong location. There we go. Slot that back in there. This is going to be the best way of being able to increase the amount of damage that we will be doing. The main reason is because we have a 5% base crit rate with Freyna, so it makes no sense to go into critical hit damage with her. It's because we can never get it consistent enough that it fills without the use of something like Luna. So therefore, being able to go into this just basically makes you a one-man kind of walking tank, and you can just pretty much detonate everything that exists. So this is the best way to increase the amount of damage. Now, this build is also going to be using a 1 HP. In fact, all the builds that we're going to be talking about are going to be using 1 HP, and that works with Distorted Resolve. I will talk about a couple of things that you can swap over if you do want to use the Slayer set, but Overwhelming Shield is definitely going to be slotted in here. And just because we don't want to be like basically one-shot by everything, we do want to be able to have an increased HP mod as well, essentially giving us a little bit of staying power, just so we can take a couple of hits in case some of them actually don't die straight away. We can actually fall back on this build. Lastly, we want to be able to go into things like range. Range is going to be a really nice kind of like feel for this build. So going into skill expansion as well as maximize range is going to be the best way of being able to do that. That gives us 186% onto our skill effect range and almost hits our cap, so we get to just shy. So we're essentially missing out on that 0.5 meter radius. But essentially this works really nicely with the skills, but it also works really nicely with Contagion, allowing us to be able to affect even more enemies nearby. Lastly, one of the best things that I would recommend in terms of this kind of build is going to be things like skill duration. While this is mostly normally used in the past for things like our skill 4, it's actually going to be here as a staying power for our actual skills to leave on the ground, and this is the reason why we can get away with using 1 to 2 skills per defense wave. So things like Putrid Venom, you can see it lasts on the floor for 16.4 seconds, and then we get our cooldown back 7.6 seconds, so we can just kind of cast this out basically everywhere we kind of need it to, and this is absolutely fantastic. I would recommend being able to go for a skill extension just to round the build up, and that essentially means that you can just rely on those 2 skills to get away with. If you are going to be using things like the Slayer set instead of Distorted Resolve, there are a couple of things that I would suggest that you be able to slot in instead. Mainly, I would recommend taking off Overwhelming Shield, because without the Distorted Resolve, there's no point going into that 1 HP build. Instead, you can chuck in things like Battle of Stamina, which is... Stamina, there we go, which gives you a little bit more HP, so more staying power, but it also gives you skill duration, really working nicely with skill extension. Or alternatively, you can actually go for weighing the scales. While this isn't going to give you too much shield, it is going to help offset that skill cost ready for your Slayer set that you do actually have on. And on top of that, because it is a Cerulean slot, when you do actually get that Distorted Resolve set, you can then just swap those 2 out and about, and that's the reason why I'd suggest being able to go for those 2 mods. Now switching on to our fast Colossus, like I said, this is to be able to get those early door kind of Colossus fights just out and about and just get those done and dusted. So we want to be able to maximize on the amount of DPS. We're not going to look at survivability too much. In fact, I don't think we actually look at it at all for this build. So we're going to be looking as to how we can cram as much damage into this build as possible. Best way to do that is actually going to be with the Red Transcendence mod of Venom Injection. Having this active will give us skill power modifier increase of 66% once we're at 1 HP. Just know that if you do go for a Slayer set version of this, you do need to be able to get down to the cap of 15%. Is it 5% or 15%? I think it is 15%. So once you're down to the point of when HP is not being taken in, now goes to MP, you're essentially then getting the maximum boost of that 66% skill power modifier. Being able to have that on top of being able to reduce their toxin resistance by 25% is fantastic, and that means that we're essentially going to be chucking out as much DPS with this build. Now, to be able to combine with things like this, and once again, if you've seen my DPS calculations, you'll know that the best way to be able to do that is going to be maximize skill. Maximize skill combined with going into toxic amplification is going to be the best way to increase the amount of damage. These 2 in combination, while this does actually hinder our skill cooldown, we're essentially going to be 1 bursting with our skill 4 anyway, so there's just no need to worry about that at all. Overwhelming Shield, once again, makes a stay here. We will talk about a couple of options that you probably well, we'll talk about one option that you could swap in here. If you are using Slayer set, you can swap this out for a HP up so you can tank a few hits. But personally, I think Overwhelming Shield combined with Venom Injection is the way to go. But once again, it all kind of resolves around if you've got that Distorted Resolve set. So make sure you do get yourself a nice firm of that. On top of that, we are looking to boost up our damage a little bit more. So we do go for Tech Amplification. This does boost our skill power modifiers a little bit more. While it doesn't actually show here, it is actually doing it in the background, so we definitely want that. And then lastly, we'd want Tech Specialist, just be able to give ourselves even more modifier on that, so our skill power really just kind of combines really nicely with those modifiers. Dangerous Ambush is also a fantastic stay here because we do want to be able to, we will get them into a mobilized state, so getting that extra 49.8% skill power is fantastic here. And just kind of round this all off, we do want to be able to go for Venom Synctium, and this is essentially is kind of like the nice bit of core. And then lastly, just to really add on top of that, we do actually chuck in a Spear and Shield, giving us a little bit of defense so we can take a couple hits, but it's also mainly for that skill power, which is fantastic. Just to be able to, it does leave us with 2 mods. The main ones that I do recommend being able to go for here are going to be Skill Extension. Nope. God, I love these menus sometimes. Skill Extension, which works really nicely with the skill extensions, just to make sure that you do actually chuck out every single one of the shots when combined with that of our Secret Garden build that we did have earlier. And then something like Nimble Fingers, or being able to go for HP. God, I really hate this menu sometimes. There we go. Being able to go for Time Distribution. Gives us a little bit more HP, but it does also help out. But it's just one of the better ones that does kind of go in this slot. So once again, doesn't affect anything else that pretty much goes forward, and you don't need to use another catalyst. So going for Time Distribution gives us a little bit of cooldown to help us out a little bit more, but mostly it's there for the HP, and that allows us to be able to actually have a little bit more there so we can take a couple more hits. This works absolutely fine for Executioner, works absolutely fine for being able to go for Pyromaniac, as well as going in for the Cold One as well. So you'll be absolutely fine with this build. You'll be good until you get to Swamp Walker. Swamp Walker require, because he's able to resist so much when it comes to your toxic abilities, you will need the next builds that we're going to be swapping over to now. So for our third build, this is going to be our Toxin Colossus. The main way to be able to build this one, though, is going into as much toxic resistance as possible, and we're also looking for tankiness. The reason why is because when you go into Deathstalker, you essentially need to be able to tank a couple of hits every now and then, otherwise you're going to be kind of letting the rest of your side down. To be able to build into this one, though, we are going to be looking into things like HP, even more shield. We're going to be looking for reductions to the amount of cost for our abilities, things like that. So we are just going to still be building a little bit into skill power, just so that our skills actually do something. We might as well still be able to chuck those out from time to time, especially since we are able to reduce things like toxic resistance when we use things like Venom Injection. Once again, does get a mainstay into this build. Now, while this one does work really nicely for increasing the amount of DPS that we did have in the previous build, this one's mostly going to be used for that toxin resistance increase. Once you're actually at low health, in which case we will be using, once again, Overwhelming Shield, which will be slotted in here. Because we're going to be at 1 HP and it's going to be taking away from our MP, we're essentially going to have that max toxin resistance increase right from the get-go. So that 250% is going to be fantastic, and it allows us to be able to actually absorb a couple of hits. We can revive teammates, we can essentially stay alive inside the rings, we can take a couple of things. And on top of that, because Venom Injection is also going to give us our shield recovery per second, we're essentially just regenning several bits of our health every single second, so it's just really good staying power in that kind of sense. So how are we building around this? Well, might as well go into the HP side of things first, or in terms of the shield, because that makes the most sense for what we've just been talking about. Now, the first thing that you do want to go for is going to be your increased HP. Increased HP stays right there. Stim Accelerant also gets a nice slot in here. That one goes there. And then on top of that, we are also going for that Time Distribution, which is also going to give us even more HP as well. As you can see, we've got this up to 504.9% when it comes to our max HP already. But we go one further because we are also going for an increased shield mod on top of that. And essentially, this really kind of gives us our almost 17k shield, and because of the resistance and because of how this is going to be reducing the amount of damage Deathstalker is going to be chucking our way, we're going to be able to tank a lot of hits, so you definitely want to be able to go for things like that. And talking of Deathstalker specifically, we do want to be able to go for things to be able to increase our resistance. So Toxin Antibody is going to be going in straight in there, and on top of that we are also going to be going for Perfect Anti-Venom. This combination between the two is going to give us some really nice kind of like toxic resistance, also making us immune to poison, which is fantastic for Deathstalker. But as you can see here, we do have 5.9k toxin resistance for the time being. So as soon as we come out of this and then we activate our Venom Toxic Sense, and then I go straight back into here, you can now see our toxic resistance is huge. Essentially, this is what going to be tanking and absorbing so many of those shots that are going to be coming our way, and essentially allows us to kind of hit that cap for that toxin resistance, which is that 80%, which is huge. So yeah, we're essentially going to be kind of like standing there and just taking everything that's going to be coming our way. So I do recommend this kind of setup, especially for Swamp Orca. Swamp Orca just kind of tickles. I think you can actually regen more than Swamp Orca does damage when he comes with those homing missiles, but when it comes to like Deathstalker, yeah, you'll essentially be able to pick up your teammates and you'll be able to work as like a kind of makeshift Eugen in that kind of sense. So we still have 3 mods to be able to slot in here. Maximize Conservation takes up one of those though, and the reason why is because we want to reduce the cost of our Venom Injection that's taking our MP every single second. So getting this down from 6 MP down to 3.9 means that we can at some point be able to offset this. If we manage to get outside of combat, we can essentially keep this regen all the way and topped up. And it just allows it to be able to last for longer without actually draining fully from our MP resources, which is great. And then lastly, because we still want to be able to do a little bit of damage when it comes to our skill 1, our skill 3, and our skill 4, we do actually go for the very nice combination of Focus on Toxic, which gives us a little bit of help with our cooldown, just a tiny little bit, and then also Toxic Amplification, which just kind of rounds this all up. So we get to do a decent chunk of damage, but on top of that we also get a little bit of cooldown in combination with our time distribution, just in case we do accidentally knock this off, and we also want to be able to cast some of our skills out as well. But this is the main kind of build that you will be using for the majority of your time that you're going to be out and about when you're running around in the First Ascendant. And this is going to be our DPS mobbing. Now, the idea with this one is that we want to be able to have just enough sustain, just enough survivability that we can take a few hits, because we are going to be going into 400% with this. So there will be quite a lot of enemies that are going to be existing on the screen, and we don't want to be going down, and we also want to maximize out our DPS so that we can then just kind of clear these as fast as possible, get to those bosses, and then just wipe the floor with them. So the best way to be able to do this is once again a 1 HP build, which is going to be our Venom Injection. Once again, it's going to be combined with our Overwhelming Shield. This gives us our 1 HP and then gives us the most kind of benefit from this mod. We will be looking into things like cooldown. Cooldown is going to be a great mainstay for this, so MP conversion and then chucking in a Nimble Fingers as well. This once again puts us up to 62.1%, and we will be then going into Focus on Tech to kind of give us a little bit more. We kind of just want to... There we go. We still want to increase our skill power modifiers, which helps with the rest of our skills, helps with our damage over time, but it's also giving us a little bit more cooldown, so we will actually be able to then spam these abilities out just as and when we kind of need those. Now, we do need a little bit of survivability, like we already have talked about, so we definitely want to go for a HP mod once again. Increased HP is absolutely fantastic and is pretty much a mainstay, but we also want to increase our shield as well, so that we then do have a really nice combination, and just gives us just enough so we can actually get some really nice survivability, tank a few hits, and then we can regen it straight back with Venom Injection. Now, the last two things that we need to worry about are going to be range and damage. Now, the main ways that we're going to be doing that is if we go into range first. Skill expansion takes a slot straight away with no downsides whatsoever. And then lastly, we do have amplification control. Now, this does mean that we do sacrifice a little bit of that range compared to going things like maximized range. But as you can see, we are still touching around about 10 meters instead of 11.5. So yes, it does kind of hurt a little bit, but to be honest with you, it's still more than enough. I don't think we actually need to be able to push this out anymore. This seemed to be more than enough to be able to chuck it into a group. Depending on like spawns and things like this, you can still actually cover the whole spawn that everyone kind of like drops in. So this is still more than enough for everything that you kind of need inside those kind of things. You don't need the range that you need with like AFK farming or anything like that, but DPS mobbing, this is more than enough to be able to go into that. And then lastly, obviously, it's just the standard combination, power increase, as well as toxic amplification. Once again, giving you the best kind of DPS that you can do without any sacrifice onto your cooldowns. If you are looking to be able to go into this with the Slayer set though, obviously you can change a few things. You can take off things like Overwhelming Shield and Increased Shield because they're not going to be doing anything for you. Because of the slots that we do have there, instead you can go for Venom Cinctium in place of Increased Shield. So for example, we can put that there. We can take off Overwhelming Shield there. Things like Decimator is a decent kind of ability, so if you do want to be able to go and put one more additional catalyst in here, Decimator is alright. We do also have MP Collector, which obviously is that one, so if you are struggling to be able to get some of your MP back, you can actually use that one. And then lastly, Tech Amp is also going to be one of the better kind of like mods to be able to put in, because this gives you more of a skill power modifier than that of Decimator, and because you don't actually have to work for this one, I would recommend this one over any of the others. But feel free to be able to actually just slot things like that in there instead, to be able to actually increase the amount of damage. If you're going for a Slayer set, that's the other things that I would recommend to do. But if you are going for a Distorted Resolve, then the first build is going to be for you. And with all that out of the way, that wraps it up on the video and every build you could possibly need for Freyna in her current state. With the new Toxic Descendant releasing soon, I definitely have my eyes open to see how it will compare to Freyna. Seeing as Freyna is leading the pack in terms of content clearing potential, it's going to take a lot to dethrone her from the rest of the cast. But this is the section I want to hear from you. How are you still finding the first Descendant? Are you looking forward to Season 2? And are you a Slayer or a Distorted Resolve kind of Freyna player? Let me know all that and more down below. Massive thank you for making your way to the end of the video, and as I always say, keep yourself safe, keep yourselves well, I'll see you all on the next video.